Investment. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Investment. I'm glad you're here today because there's something interesting circulating in the dinar space that a lot of people are talking about right now. Investment, and it involves one of the largest banks in the United States, Wells Fargo. Now, before we go any further, quick reminder, like always, this is not financial advice. Investment. I'm not a financial advisor, and nothing in this video should be taken as a prediction of dates or specific rates. What we're doing here is looking at information, investment, signals, patterns, and discussing possibilities. That's it. So always do your own research and make your own decisions. Now, with that said, investment. Let's talk about what people are seeing and why this conversation is suddenly heating up again. So here's the situation. Over the last few days, investment, several discussions in the currency community have been pointing toward internal banking chatter involving Wells Fargo and potential readiness around foreign currency exchange infrastructure. Investment. Now that alone doesn't automatically mean anything dramatic is happening tomorrow. Investment. But when people start hearing references connected to Iraqi dinar values being modeled above $3, naturally it grabs attention. Investment. But here's where we need to slow down and actually think logically. When large banks like Wells Fargo run internal systems or currency models, investment, they often simulate multiple possible exchange rates for foreign currencies. These simulations can be used for liquidity planning, international settlements, trade calculations, or contingency planning. In other words, banks constantly test what-if scenarios in investment. So when people hear a number like $3 attached to the Iraqi dinar in a banking context, the immediate reaction online is usually excitement. Investment. But what we need to ask ourselves is a much more grounded question. Why would a bank even model something like that in the first place? Investment. Because banks don't randomly test numbers for fun. They usually model rates based on potential economic reforms, future trade expectations, investment, or scenarios where a country's currency structure changes dramatically. And that brings us to Iraq itself. Over the last couple of years, investment, Iraq has been quietly restructuring major parts of its financial system. We've seen reforms involving digital payments, international banking compliance, investment, and attempts to stabilize the currency market inside the country. The Central Bank of Iraq has also been tightening control over the dollar auctions, investment, which historically were one of the biggest pressure points in the Iraqi economy. For those who have followed this story for a long time, investment, you already know that Iraq's currency situation is unique. Right now, the official exchange rate sits around 1,310 dinar per US dollar. That's a managed rate. Investment. But what's interesting is that Iraq has one of the largest oil reserves in the world, significant natural resources, investment, and a population that has been moving more toward electronic banking and structured financial oversight. So the big question analysts ask, is this investment? Could Iraq eventually move toward a stronger currency structure as reforms continue? Now, again, we're not predicting that here, investment, but we are looking at why banks might run models involving higher rates. Think about global trade for a moment. If Iraq expands oil exports, increases non-oil revenues, investment, and strengthens international banking ties, its currency structure could theoretically change in the long term. Countries have done this before. When economies grow, investment, currencies can be revalued, redenominated, or restructured depending on policy decisions. And when banks prepare for those possibilities, investment, they don't wait until the last minute. They build systems early. Now let's shift to another interesting piece of this conversation, bank readiness, investment. One of the reasons Wells Fargo keeps getting mentioned in dinar discussions is because historically they have had infrastructure for foreign currency exchange. Years ago, investment. Many US banks actually sold Iraqi dinar to customers as a collectible foreign currency. At that time, it was treated similar to other exotic currencies. Investment. But something changed after the global financial tightening that happened in the mid-2010s. Many banks stopped directly selling dinar. Investment. Not necessarily because the currency disappeared, because regulatory oversight around foreign currencies became stricter. Investment. Compliance departments inside banks became extremely cautious about handling currencies that didn't have strong international liquidity. However, investment, that doesn't mean banks removed all internal capabilities to process them. Large institutions rarely delete financial infrastructure. They usually place it in standby. Investment. So when people hear about internal readiness or system testing, investment, it sometimes simply means banks are making sure their technology could process transactions if a currency suddenly becomes internationally tradable again. Investment. Think about it like this. If tomorrow a country announces a currency reform and that currency suddenly becomes active in global markets, investment. Banks don't want to scramble to build systems from scratch. They want their exchange systems ready to go. And this is where speculation starts connecting the dots. Investment. Some observers believe that banks may be quietly preparing systems in case Iraq eventually moves toward a new currency framework that allows broader international exchange. Investment. Now again, we need to stay realistic here. Preparing systems does not equal confirmation that a rate change is about to happen. Investment banks prepare for thousands of financial possibilities all the time. Investment. But what makes this conversation interesting is that Iraq itself has been taking steps toward global financial integration. Let's talk about that for a second. Investment. Over the past few years, Iraq has been working to align with international banking standards like anti-money laundering protocols and digital payment reforms. They've been encouraging citizens to use bank accounts instead of cash, expanding electronic payment networks, and partnering with international financial organizations. Investment. Why does that matter? Because countries that want stronger currencies typically need stronger banking systems. Investment. A stable currency doesn't just come from oil revenue or natural resources. It comes from financial transparency, controlled money supply, investment and international trust in the banking system. And Iraq has been working toward those goals step by step. Investment. Now here's another layer to consider that people sometimes overlook. Currency values are not just economic decisions. They're also political decisions. Investment. Governments often manage exchange rates carefully because sudden changes can shock an economy. If a currency becomes stronger too quickly, exports can become expensive. If it weakens too much, imports become costly and inflation rises. So when analysts talk about potential long-term rate adjustments for the Iraqi dinar investment, they usually frame it within a gradual economic transition rather than a sudden overnight leap. However, investment speculation still appears online because people see patterns forming. For example, the reduction of the dollar auction system, stronger control over currency smuggling, investment, and attempts to stabilize the parallel market rate inside Iraq, investment. Those are the kinds of policies central banks use when they want tighter control over their monetary system. Investment. And tighter control is usually the first step before any serious currency reform. Investment. Now let's circle back to Wells Fargo for a moment, because this is where the headline conversation comes from. Investment. When large financial institutions test currency scenarios, they sometimes include ranges based on historical purchasing power comparisons. In Iraq's case, investment. Before the Gulf War in the early 1990s, the Iraqi dinar actually held a much higher value relative to the US dollar. Investment. Now that historical value existed in a completely different economic environment. Iraq had a different monetary structure, different supply levels of currency, investment, and a different global political situation. But analysts sometimes use historical benchmarks when modeling theoretical future currency structures. Investment. So if a bank were to simulate a scenario where Iraq restructured its currency system, maybe through redenomination, asset backing discussions, or economic reform, investment. Those simulations might include higher values simply as part of stress testing. That's not confirmation of anything, it's just modeling. Investment. But when those numbers circulate online, they naturally trigger excitement in the currency community, and that's what we're seeing right now. At the same time, investment. Something else interesting has been happening globally. We're seeing a shift toward digital banking systems and faster cross-border payment networks. Investment. Financial institutions worldwide are upgrading technology so currencies can move more efficiently between countries. Why is that relevant here? Investment, because if Iraq eventually wants its currency to participate more actively in global trade, investment. Its banking system must be compatible with those international payment networks, which again brings us back to preparation. Banks often prepare quietly years before a major financial transition occurs. They test systems, run models, and ensure compliance frameworks are in place. Investment. Most of that work happens behind the scenes long before the public hears anything about it. Investment. And that's why conversations about banking readiness sometimes spark curiosity among people watching the Dinar story unfold. Now, does that mean Wells Fargo or any other bank is confirming a future rate above $3? No, there's no official confirmation of that. Investment. But the fact that people are discussing potential modeling scenarios tells us something important. Investment. Major financial institutions do pay attention to global currency developments. Investment. And Iraq is definitely one of the countries analysts watch closely because of its resources and strategic economic position. Investment. Now, before we move further into what this could potentially mean going forward, we need to talk about something that many new viewers might not understand. Investment, the difference between a currency revaluation, a redenomination, and a market-driven appreciation. Investment, because these three concepts get mixed together all the time in the dinar community, and they actually mean very different things. Investment. And understanding those differences is critical if we want to make sense of why banks might model certain numbers or prepare for certain scenarios. Investment. So in the next section, we're going to break that down, look at how central banks approach currency restructuring, investment, and discuss what kinds of signals analysts typically watch when a country might be moving toward a major monetary shift. And once you understand that framework, investment, the Wells Fargo conversation starts to make a lot more sense. So stick with me. Investment, because this next part connects some dots that most people completely miss when they first start following the Iraqi Dinar story. All right, guys, investment, let's keep going because this is where the conversation starts to get really interesting. And again, quick reminder before we move deeper into this, investment. None of this is financial advice. There are no confirmed dates or rates being discussed here, and we're simply looking at possibilities, patterns, investment, and how global banking systems usually prepare for currency changes. So earlier we started talking about the difference between a revaluation, a redenomination, investment, and market appreciation. And this is extremely important because when people hear numbers like $3 attached to the Iraqi dinar, investment, the first reaction is usually excitement, but very few people stop to ask how a currency would even reach a level like that. Let's start with redenomination. A redenomination is when a country removes zeros from its currency. For example, imagine if 1,000 dinar suddenly became one new dinar. Investment. The purchasing power inside the country would stay the same, but the numbers would look smaller. Investment. Many countries have done this before when their currencies carried too many zeros due to inflation. Turkey did it. Brazil did it. Investment. Several Eastern European countries did it as well. Now, when redenominations happen, investment, they usually don't make people suddenly wealthy because prices inside the country adjust at the same time. If your salary was 1,000 units before, after redenomination, it might become 1,000 units, but your buying power remains identical. That's a simple reset of the number system. A revaluation is different. Investment. A revaluation happens when a government or central bank officially increases the value of its currency relative to other currencies. Investment. This usually occurs in countries that manage their exchange rates instead of allowing the market to control the price. Investment. China has done controlled revaluations of the yuan in the past. Kuwait did it after the Gulf War when their currency system was restored. In those cases, investment. The central bank adjusted the official exchange rate based on economic stability and national policy. But here's the key thing, investment. Revaluations usually happen when a country has strong reserves, strong exports, and confidence in its financial system. Then we have market appreciation. Investment. This is when a currency simply becomes stronger over time because investors and trade demand push the value upward. It's not announced overnight. Investment. It happens gradually through international markets. Now, here's why all of this matters when people start talking about the Iraqi dinar and numbers like $3. Investment. For something like that to even enter the conversation in a realistic scenario, there would have to be major structural changes in Iraq's monetary system. Investment. And believe it or not, Iraq has actually discussed monetary restructuring for years. Investment. One concept that has been mentioned many times by Iraqi officials is something called the project to delete the zeros. Investment. If you followed dinar news for a long time, you've probably heard that phrase before. It's been discussed by the Central Bank of Iraq for over a decade. Investment. The idea behind deleting the zeros is essentially a redenomination plan. Investment. It would simplify the currency by introducing smaller denominations and reducing the massive numbers currently used in daily transactions. Right now, investment. Many everyday purchases in Iraq require large stacks of banknotes because the denomination structure is so high. Investment. If they removed zeros and introduced a new currency series, transactions inside the country would become much easier. But here's where speculation begins to grow. Investment. Some analysts believe that a redenomination alone might not be the only step. Investment. They think Iraq could eventually move toward a broader monetary reform that strengthens the currency internationally once the banking system becomes more stable. Again, Investment, that's speculation, but it's the kind of scenario banks sometimes model internally. And this is where the Wells Fargo conversation fits into the puzzle. Investment. If a large international bank is preparing systems to handle potential Iraqi currency exchanges, they wouldn't just model one rate. Investment. They would model dozens of possible scenarios. They might simulate a redenomination scenario. They might simulate a gradual appreciation scenario. Investment. And they might simulate a much stronger currency structure under a completely reformed economic system. Banks do this because they need to be prepared for any outcome. Investment. Think about it like weather forecasting. Meteorologists don't run just one forecast model. They run multiple models to see how different conditions might develop. Investment. Banks do something similar with currencies. Now let's talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough in the dinar space, Iraq's resource position. Iraq is consistently ranked among the top countries in the world for proven oil reserves. In fact, investment. It's often listed within the top 5 globally depending on the measurement. Oil exports are the backbone of Iraq's economy. When oil prices are strong, Iraq's government revenue increases significantly because most of its budget is tied to petroleum exports. But Iraq has also been trying to diversify its economy. Investment. There have been discussions about expanding natural gas production, agriculture, infrastructure development, and trade routes connecting Asia and Europe. Investment. Why does that matter? Because stronger economic diversity can strengthen a country's currency over time. Countries with stable exports, growing industries, investment, and strong foreign investment tend to build stronger currencies. And that's one reason international analysts watch Iraq carefully. Investment. Another factor that people sometimes overlook is Iraq's gold reserves and foreign currency reserves. Investment. Central banks maintain reserves to stabilize their currencies and maintain confidence in the financial system. These reserves usually include US dollars, gold, investment, and other international assets. Over the past several years, Iraq's reserves have grown significantly during periods of high oil revenue. Investment. As strong reserves give central banks more flexibility when managing exchange rates. Now again, reserves alone don't guarantee a stronger currency. Investment, but they are a critical piece of the puzzle if a country ever decides to adjust its monetary framework. Let's also talk about international partnerships. Investment. Iraq has been working with global financial institutions to modernize its banking sector. Investment. This includes cooperation with organizations that help countries improve financial transparency, anti-money laundering standards, and electronic payment infrastructure. Investment. Those improvements may sound technical, but they're actually extremely important. Investment. International investors and global banks are far more willing to work with countries that meet strict financial compliance standards. Investment. And the more integrated a country becomes with global finance, the more flexible its currency can become over time. And now imagine a scenario for a moment. Investment. Let's say Iraq continues improving its banking infrastructure over the next few years. Electronic payments expand across the country. Investment. International companies invest in infrastructure projects. Oil production remains strong and the government gradually reduces corruption and financial leakage. Investment. In that kind of environment, the central bank would have much more room to strengthen the currency if they chose to. Again, investment. That wouldn't necessarily mean a sudden overnight change, but it could mean gradual steps toward a stronger monetary position. Investment. And those are exactly the kinds of long-term possibilities banks model internally. Investment. This is why people pay attention when a major institution like Wells Fargo is mentioned in currency conversations. Investment. Large banks are deeply connected to international finance. They process billions of dollars in cross-border transactions every year. Investment. Their systems handle currencies from all over the world. So when internal readiness discussions appear connected to a specific currency, it naturally raises curiosity. Investment. But we have to stay grounded here. Banks preparing infrastructure does not mean they know something secret about a future exchange rate. Investment. More often, it simply means they're making sure their systems are capable of handling transactions if the currency becomes more active globally. Investment. Preparation is not confirmation, and that's a very important distinction. At the same time, something else has been happening that adds another layer to the story. Investment, the global shift away from heavy reliance on the US dollar in certain regions. Now the dollar is still the dominant global reserve currency. That hasn't changed. Investment, but several countries have been exploring trade agreements that use alternative currencies or local currency settlements. Investment. We've seen discussions among BRICS nations about expanding local currency trade. We've seen energy deals being settled in different currencies in certain cases. Investment. Why does this matter for Iraq? Because Iraq sits in a very strategic position between major economic regions, the Middle East, Asia, and Europe. Investment. If trade corridors expand across that region, Iraq could become an important energy and logistics hub. Investment. And countries that become trade hubs often see their financial systems grow stronger as international money flows through them. Now again, investment. We are not saying that automatically translates into a $3 dinar. That's not how currencies work. Investment, but it does explain why analysts keep watching Iraq's financial reforms. When you combine natural resources, improving banking systems, growing reserves, investment, and strategic trade positioning, you get a country that has the potential to evolve economically over time. Investment. And that potential is what keeps the dinar story alive in financial discussions. Now here's something interesting that many viewers may not have thought about. Investment. If Iraq ever does move toward a significant currency reform, the process would likely involve coordination between the central bank, international financial institutions, investment, and global banking partners. Major banks around the world would need time to prepare exchange systems, compliance procedures, and liquidity arrangements. Investment. That kind of preparation doesn't happen overnight. It usually happens quietly in the background. Investment, and sometimes the public only notices pieces of that preparation years later. So when you hear rumors about banks testing currency exchange scenarios, investment, it doesn't necessarily mean a change is imminent, but it does show that institutions stay aware of global currency developments. Investment. Now, in the next part of this discussion, we're going to take this even deeper. Investment, because there's another side of the Wells Fargo conversation that people are starting to notice, and it involves the possibility of exchange infrastructure, investment liquidity planning, and what banks might actually do if a currency suddenly becomes internationally tradable again. Investment, and once you understand how that process works inside major financial institutions, investment, you'll start to see why the dinar conversation keeps resurfacing every time new banking signals appear.